Our next speaker is someone I've really admired for many, many years, who's been in this debate even before we'd even heard the term net zero, and that's Professor Ian Plimer. And he's Australia's best-known geologist. He's Emeritus Professor of Earth Sciences at the University of Melbourne, where he was Professor and Head of Earth Sciences after serving at the University of Newcastle. He has a long and distinguished career in geology. I'm not going to read his whole bio. But his books on this subject of climate change have been very influential. A number of years ago, I read his book, Climate Change Delusion and the Great Electricity Rip-Off. That was published in about 2018. He's written many books on this subject. I've heard him in this debate right since probably over the last 20 years. I've never heard any refutation of the points that he's making. I think what he said has stood the test of time. I'm open to the idea that maybe humans are causing catastrophic disaster, although Jude's showed that it's not. But I'm very keen to hear Professor Plimer. I'm glad his voice is still in the public square, and we're very privileged to have him up here from Adelaide today. So please give a big warm welcome to Professor Ian Plimer.
Oh no, we're going to fry and die. We're warming. We've got global boiling. We've had the hottest summer. Well, my answer is, since when? Because since the time of Jesus, it's actually cooled. We've cooled about 5 degrees Celsius. Why did the Romans have scanty clothing? Why did they go grapes up in Yorkshire? Why did they have olives up the Rhine River as far as Bonn? It was warmer. And then in Viking times, it was cooler. And we've warmed up since Viking times. And then in medieval times, it's actually, since then, we've cooled. And it was about 5 degrees Celsius warmer. Eric the Red was saying, come to Greenland. Fabulous pastures. They grew barley, they grew wheat, they had cattle, they had sheep, they could dig graves instead of having permafrost. It was much warmer 1,000 years ago. And then we entered the Little Ice Age. And it was colder, of course, extremely cold when the sun got a bit lazy. And the last period the sun was lazy was 300 odd years ago, called the Maunder Minimum. And since the Little Ice Age ended, what do you think happened? Well, after a Little Ice Age, it's going to warm up, isn't it? And that's what's happened. We've been warming. So the real question is, which part of the modern warming is of human origin and which part is natural? Because we are not as warm as in medieval times or in Roman times or in Minoan times. And if you go back even further, looking at the ice cores, we oscillate in climate between when we're closer to the sun or when we're further away. These Milankovitch cycles have been known for only 100 years, and we are at a period of time now when we're a little bit closer to the sun. And that started 14,400 years ago. It was a Tuesday, by the way. And we started to warm up, and about 8,500 years ago we reached the peak of our interglacial, and that lasted for about 4,000 years. Now, you can see it from here. Go across to Narrabeen. Have a look at Long Reef. Have a look at the nick in the cliff beneath the cliffs and just above the rock platform. That was from about 5,000 years ago, when sea level was 2 metres higher than now. So we've had sea level drop in this area. We know that because we've had that nick all the way up eastern Australia. But earlier, sea level rose. That's why we've got the drowned river valleys like Sydney Harbour or the Hawkesbury. We know that recently there's been no sea level change. Fort Denison has had a measuring station there since it was built. And Fort Denison was built to keep out the Russian Navy in the Crimean War. And it was finished after the Crimean War finished. And it kept out the Russian Navy. It's done a great job. But they have a measuring station there. We have had no significant change in sea level. But you cannot measure sea level without measuring land level changes. We have in Adelaide a measuring station at Port Adelaide, a post out beyond Port Adelaide, and sea level has been rising. Well, it hasn't. A review of all the surveys shows that the post has been sinking. So this comes to the fundamentals of science, and that is measurement. How do you measure things? We know that the land level has risen in Scandinavia, which once had 5 kilometres of ice on it. When it started to melt on that Tuesday, 14,400 years ago, that ice went, and Scandinavia has been rising. The King of Finland wanted to increase taxation. All governments and despots have been doing that for decades, thousands of years, and so had waterfront land surveyed. We know waterfront surveys from the 17th century. That land has got bigger because the land has been rising. The castle of Turku, which was built in the 13th century, that castle was on an island in the Gulf of Bosnia. I've walked to it because the land has risen. We go to the biblical city of Ephesus, mentioned in St. Paul, mentioned in the Old Testament. Now, Ephesus was a port. It's now inland. It's now 7 metres above sea level. Nearby is the city of Lydia, where gold coins were first minted and invented. I've been down the main street of Lydia in a yacht. It was about 4 metres beneath me. So the land goes up and down all the time, as does sea level. And you cannot argue that climate change is producing sea level change unless you start to look at what the land is doing. And we have Tuvalu as the poster child. Tuvalu, oh my God, we're going to be flooded, we're going to be inundated, give us some money and that won't happen. That's the story we're being told. Well, go back into history. Charles Lyell in 1831 wrote a textbook called The Principles of Geology, and he argued that there were volcanoes in the oceans, coral reefs grew on them, and the volcano subsided and the coral kept growing up. And Charles Darwin was fascinated by that, and he went and visited all these atolls in the Pacific, and he then measured what he thought was a rate of coral growth, and he sketched in his 1842 book on coral reefs, showing that there was a volcano with a fringing coral reef. That volcano subsided, which is no different from sea level rise, and an atoll kept growing and growing and growing. And in 1896, your government here in New South Wales paid for a drill hole in Tuvalu. That was supervised by Professor Sir Edgeworth David from the University of Sydney. That drill hole went down 938 feet on Tuvalu. It went through coral all the way. And he was, from the fossils, able to get the age of the coral, and he was able to show the rate of sea level rise, never hit the volcano beneath. And it was only when there was drilling done in the Marshall Islands, getting ready for atomic bomb testing, that we actually knew how far that volcano was down below. And it was about 3 kilometres. And in the case of the Marshall Islands, 34 million years ago, sea level really started to change. That, of course, is when the Ice Age started, our current Ice Age, which I come back to. So we hear a lot of rubbish about sea level change, and it is absolute total rubbish. And we don't have people asking the simple question. And the really simple question to say is, well, if people are saying sea level's rising, the question is say, well, show me. You don't have to know any science, just show me. You need to do this to your medicos, you need to do to anyone who's trying to open your wallet. Just show me. So the ice is a very, very good indicator of climate change. For less than 20% of time, we've had ice sheets on the Earth. We're actually in a very rare period of time where we've got ice. And that's happened 6 times in the past, where we've had 6 great ice ages. Where I live in South Australia, we have in the Flinders Ranges 2 of these great ice ages. Those ice ages were when we had kilometre-thick sheets of ice at sea level, at the equator, and sea level had dropped 600 metres. And when that ice melted, sea level rose 600 metres. And we've got ice which retreated and left behind debris that are picked up going across the surface, bits of rock and soil and paddle pop sticks and fingernails and these sort of things. And it retreated, and we think it was about minus 40 Celsius. We don't know. But on top of it was a limey rock, shallow marine rock. And so sea level rose from beneath the continental shelf, over in the abyssal deeps, up 600 metres, and warm water covered the glacial debris. And from various chemical fingerprints in that limey rock, we can say that the water temperature was plus 40 degrees Celsius. There is no ocean with those temperatures now. So we had an 80 degrees Celsius change in temperature and a 600 metre change in sea level. Now, I call that climate change. And it was rapid, and it didn't happen once. It happened a number of times. And we geologists are faced with a problem. These are the biggest climate changes we've ever seen in the history of the planet, and we don't know why. Science is never settled. Science is a very important pursuit because science is married to evidence, and you collect that evidence from measurement, you collect it from experiments, you collect it from observation, and you come up with an explanation, which we call a theory. Now, you might find new evidence, or someone might review your evidence and say, wait a minute, you've made a mistake. Someone might say, well, this is not in accord with other evidence, so you have to abandon that theory. And that's what's called the coherence criterion in science. So if I have a theory of climate change that humans drive global warming, that has to be in accord with everything that's validated from the past. Now, it isn't. There is no way in the past that the massive climate changes in the past are related to carbon dioxide. We have had 6 major ice ages on planet Earth. 6 of the 6 started when there was more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than now. Now, for some of those, it was considerably more. For 4 of those ice ages, it was up to 20% carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, compared with 0.04 now. So carbon dioxide clearly cannot drive warming. We can validate that. Look at ice cores, and we can measure from volcanic ash when the ice formed and the rate of ice formation. We can measure from sulfuric acid in the ice cores, the same sort of thing. And we can measure from chemical fingerprints the temperature that the ice formed at. And there's little bits of air that were trapped in the snow that got compressed into ice. And these fluid inclusions of air, we can measure those and work out how much carbon dioxide was in the old atmosphere. And we see that we have cycles of climate. And the best we've got is about 8 of the last big cycles. And they are in ice from Greenland. These are deep holes. These go down to as far as we can get data. We can't get older data for a very good reason, that ice forms in basins in Greenland in Antarctica. And that ice moves uphill before it then flows downhill into a glacier. It's not melting when you get glaciers calving. It's due to when you compress ice, it will flow. And ice is like glass. You can bend glass over a long period of time, or you hit it with a hammer and it breaks. The same with ice. You can bend it, or you can hit it with a hammer. Now, when you bend it, new crystals of ice form. And we see that in glaciers. At the head of the glacier, there's tiny crystals. At the toe of the glacier, after it's recrystallised and recrystallised and recrystallised as it's moving down slope, you get big crystals of ice. So the ice is moving out of the glacier, up and then down the glaciers onto the sea. That's why we can't get really old ice at the bottom of our ice sheets. So these drill holes, we can tell again from these chemical fingerprints and inclusions of air and bits of volcanic ash that we're getting cycles. And these cycles are every 100,000 years, every 40,000 years, and every 20,000 years. And these are Milankovitch cycles. The first is where we go from a circular to an elliptical orbit. The second is where the axis of the Earth changes a little bit. Again, with both of those, you get closer or further to the sun. And the third one is you'll wobble a bit like a top and get closer or further from the sun. We've measured those cycles, we've known about them for 100 years, and we see them preserved in the ice. And each time it's been warmer in the past, in those interglacials, it was much warmer than now, and we had long periods, much longer than our current interglacial. So when you hear about the climate is unprecedented, that's absolutely, totally unmitigated rubbish. The past gives us a very different story. So again, I follow on from the previous speaker talking about lies. What we're dealing with is not science. because the theory that human emissions of carbon dioxide drive global warming has never been shown. It has never been shown that human emissions drive global warming. And if you could show it, then you'd have to show that the 97% of natural emissions don't drive global warming. That hasn't been done also. Now, natural emissions come from the oceans, from volcanoes, from breathing out. And if you're really passionate about net zero and really concerned about net zero, there's a simple solution. You breathe in air at 0.04% carbon dioxide, you metabolise all the carbon-bearing foods you ate to build up your carbon-rich body, and you breathe out carbon dioxide. And you breathe out 4% carbon dioxide. So if you are passionate about global warming, drop dead. Really simple, drop dead. You cannot argue with the data because you can measure carbon dioxide in the air. It would be about 1,000 parts per million in this room, 1,200 at the optimum level we should have on planet Earth to make plants grow. So carbon dioxide is the gas of life. And we see geologically that we've had a decrease in carbon dioxide as soon as we got the appearance of organisms that have shells, that have skeletons, and that have an epidermis that's got a lot of carbon compounds in it. And we've had, over the last 520 million years, we've had a decrease from 0.7% carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to 0.04. In fact, the chap who founded Greenpeace, Dr. Patrick Moore, who wrote the foreword of my book, Not for Greens, which upset the Gillard government so much they spent $500,000 of your money setting up a website attacking me, which was good because you're hitting home when they start to do things like that. You know you're hurting them. He argues, he's the founder of Greenpeace, a bit on the left for me, but he's a friend, but he argued that we humans should be burning limestone, making cement and putting carbon dioxide back where it came from. That's in the atmosphere. We should be burning fossil fuels, put the carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere where it came from, because we are now at a dangerously low level in the atmosphere. If we halved it, we would have no plant life on Earth. And with no plants, we have no animals. We're gone. So what we're hearing about carbon dioxide is total, absolute nonsense. It is the gas of life. It is not poisonous. Yes, it's colourless. Yes, it's odourless. Yes, it's tasteless. But you can scare people with things you don't see and don't smell, like radioactivity, like a virus, like a bacterium, like carbon dioxide. You can scare people. But it's very simple. Ask the question, how much carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere? And most people can't give you the answer. Then say, well, how much was there in the atmosphere, say, 500 million years ago? No one knows the answer. If you take it 1 billion years ago, it was 20%. And what happened? We had ice ages, and when the ice lifted, life just thrived. So we know from the fossil record, every time we've had high carbon dioxide, life has exploded. Life has taken off. And then we hear another piece of misinformation, that we are in the 6th great mass extinction. Well, yes, we've had 5 mass extinctions of life, and this is where you wipe out more than 50% of species, up to 96% of species in the Permian mass extinction. And we've had many minor mass extinctions. But throughout the history of time, we've had a species turnover. So critters are always becoming extinct, and the new ecology is being filled by other critters. That's normal. So yes, we are having critters go extinct. But all that's telling us is we're in normal times. And we are having a species turnover. And just because an organism becomes extinct, it doesn't mean that that ecology becomes a desert or is ruined. Something else fills the ecology. And what we forget are my favourite organisms. We never hear about them. They are the largest biomass on Earth, and that's bacteria. And bacteria have been around since we first got fossils of them in the Pilbara, and they're 2,764 million years old. That's only for half of the history of the planet. But bacteria, they live in ice. They live in clouds. They live in rocks. The first 4 kilometres underneath your feet is teeming with bacteria. They live in soils. Your body has 90% of your cells are bacterial. You are a creeping colony of critters. 15% of your weight is bacteria. They live in acid conditions. They live in alkaline conditions. There's bacteria out at Arkaroola in the far north Flinders Ranges where there's radioactive hot springs at 52 Celsius and bacteria are thriving in there. There are algal mats in there. So that is the ultimate survivor. And we even think that there's bacteria on Mars, and we think that some of them have been transferred from Mars to Earth. All you have to remember is ALH 84001, look it up. That's a meteorite in which these were found, a Martian meteorite. So the main life on Earth we ignore, and that's bacteria. And what do bacteria do? Well, they emit gases of life. We hear about the Amazon being the lungs of the Earth. No, it's slime in the ocean. It is slime that sucks up carbon dioxide and gives out oxygen. Yes, the Amazon's important, but it's the slime is much, much more important. So almost everything you hear is absolute nonsense. We hear that, the change in climate is the most rapid we've ever seen in the history of Earth. No, not at all. We have very good records from geology, archaeology and chemistry to show that a period of time called the Younger Dryas was when it suddenly got cold. And this is in our current interglacial. This was at about 9,000 years ago when we had a break-up of the Canadian ice sheet and it just dropped huge amounts of ice into the Atlantic Ocean. The top of the ocean became very cold and it was fresh water, and underneath was warmer saline water. And it took about 1,500 years for the ice to flip and the oceans to start to warm. But during that time, we humans got smart. We invented villages, but they were fortified villages. There had to be warfare going on to have fortified villages. We invented animal husbandry. We invented agriculture. So that climate change, we had a temperature drop of about 15 degrees Celsius. And it obviously warmed up since then. How quickly? Oh, well, it was only 15 degrees Celsius in 2 decades. That's a rate faster than anything that's measured today that's used to frighten you. So the past is telling us a completely different story. This is why the IPCC, this is why the CSIRO and other groups never talk about the past. Because they know that the past is telling them a different story. It's not in accord with their theory. Therefore, you must reject their theory. But they won't do it because most of the people promoting these ideas are eminently unemployable, and they live off your taxes, frightening us witless, and living in climate institutes around the world. And what happens is, and we heard Bella talk earlier about the schools, what happens is that kids at school are being frightened. They are having a huge amount of stress because the world is going to end. Now, in one of my books, I just wrote the 2,000-year history of people predicting the end of the world. Now, we're still here. So every one of them had to be incorrect. If one of them was right, we wouldn't be here. So they're wrong. And it's obvious that kids are being polluted. Kids are not being taught how to think. They're not being taught how to critically think. And they're not actually being taught respect, which is a word that Mr Albanese used a lot recently. I was at the Ballarat Bush Summit where he got heckled by farmers for every good reason, as was the Premier. And he was talking about, give me some respect. And the farmer's reply was very simple. You respect us, and then we will respect you. So our kids are being taught absolute total rubbish and propaganda. Now, I went to school just up near here, Normanhurst Boys High School. You've got to get the apostrophe right on the boys. And if we didn't do our Latin homework, we were caned. And that was the only way you could learn Latin, because Our Latin teacher, he could hurt you. And if I told my parents I didn't do my Latin homework, I'd get belted also. And I was in a state school. We did Latin, French, German, English, mathematics, history, geography, physics and chemistry. That was a state school. And if we had come out with any of this rubbish, we would have been asked to explain why. And at the age of 12, I knew the first 20 elements in the periodic table, and that is the basis of understanding all of science. Kids today don't know that. They don't know. If you ask them a simple question, what's the molecular weight of this gas that's going to kill you, carbon dioxide? It's 44, by the way. They don't know it. They should know the basics before they can have an opinion and before they can even get an informed opinion. So we are driving kids into, to me, intellectual poverty. And we heard earlier about what is the greatest threat. I think one of the greatest threat we've got is the dumbing down of our education system, coupled with stupidity. And that has led to, I think, an absolute disaster. And that's why I wrote these 3 little books, which I'll be selling at lunchtime. It's the way of paying my airfares up and back. This one's for 8-year-old kids, and it's for ankle biters. And what do 8-year-old kids roll about laughing about? Well, it's body functions. So I talk about what you eat and how you get rid of it. With poo, with wee. I go into the chemistry of wee, in kids' language. Farting, of course. They roll around giggling with laughter. And why does that happen? I go into snot, which kids love. And basically, I'm trying to tell young kids that without carbon, you don't live. And you get carbon in that food. The second one is for teens, and we know what they're like. They're horrible, and they'll open the fridge door. It'll be packed with food, and they'll say, "There's nothing to eat," or they'll take a moral stance with you that you're driving an internal combustion engine, whereas Johnny's parents, they're driving an electric vehicle. Simple. Just point out that electric vehicle has cobalt in it. It's mined by kids your age who are slaves in the Congo working for Chinese companies. They die in these underground mines. They die in the open pits, and they die of cobalt poisoning. Is that fair? I think you've got to impose moral arguments on younger children because these moral arguments actually hit home. One of the other arguments I use is that we've been through fads in the history of time, the South Sea bubble, the Dutch tulip craze, but I go into the fad of burning witches. And in the Maunder minimum, it was bitterly cold, and harvest after harvest after harvest failed. It was obviously due to the witches. So they were rounded up and burnt. And I've got a graph in there showing the number of witches that were burnt plotted against temperature. And as soon as it started to warm up after the Maunder minimum, we stopped burning witches. Therefore, witches must have controlled the bad harvests. That's the proof. And I'm trying to get kids to think about logic. There are some ridiculous logical arguments that are used, and you have to be able to tear them apart as a child. And the third one is for 20s and wrinklies, which includes most of this room. And this is just, again, written in the punter's language with a few diagrams like that one there showing the cycles of cooling and warming. The warm is in the darker colour and the cool is no colour. We just get cycles of warming. And we geologists know these cycles. Every time you have the continents pull apart or stitch together, that's every 400 million years. We know that. We've measured it. We can still measure it. Every 143 million years, we're in the wrong address in the galaxy. We can measure it. That's when you get massive ice ages. Every 100,000 years, 40,000 years and 20,000 years, we're closer or further from the sun. They're the Milankovitch cycles, the orbital cycles. We've just recently discovered a cycle due to Mars every 2.5 million years. We don't understand that. So science can never be settled. And then we have solar cycles every 10,000 years, 1,500 years, 217 years, 87 years and 22 years. We've known that 22-year cycle for over 300 years. And then we have lunar tidal nodes. Every 18.7 years we push warm water into the Arctic. Just look at when the Northwest Passage was open. That's every 18.7 years because we push warm water up into there. We know there are 60-year cycles in the oceans. The Chinese had their calendars based on 60 years because this gave them good and bad harvests. So the third booklet is to give you the basics for an argument. So just to finish off, I argue that this nonsense about climate change will never change people's minds on the science, because this is the new religion. This is the new religion where there's sin, where you pay penance, where you can buy indulgences, where there's a holy book, which is the IPCC, which no one's read and understands, and we have the high priests. Some of them fail, like your Tim Flannerys of the world, but it is the new religion. What will change is a crisis. It will be a financial crisis or a war, but unfortunately that's going to be when we change. Let's hope it's not too late. But I believe this is an attack on freedom. This is an attack on everything that Western civilization stands for. And Western civilization started in Greek times, and then with Christianity, then with Justinian law, and then a stepwise change upward, forward and backwards over the 2,000 years since then. This is an attack on everything that's important to us. It's an attack on the family, it's an attack on your pocketbook, it's an attack on logic, it's an attack on common sense. And once we used to use logic, once we had governments that actually didn't chase votes from Greens, they looked after the welfare of this country. Now, the people who are suffering from this are the poor people. They cannot pay their bills. They cannot put on the solar system on their roof. They are being absolutely wiped out. I think we're dealing with the biggest scientific fraud that there has been in the history of time. I think we're dealing with governments who are absolutely and totally leaderless. You cannot attack the Labor government if you're a Liberal for their views on climate, because the Libs were just as bad. And I think that from my experience by working in totalitarian countries, and I worked a number of times in Iran, many times in Turkey, I've worked 20 times in Saudi and I'm still working there. And in fact, I've got a book coming out at CPAC in 3 weeks' time, just of short stories which I wrote at the time of my experiences with totalitarianism. I think we're creeping towards totalitarianism. And the final comment to give proof of that is that there is a Senate inquiry headed by a Green, dominated by Labor. Fortunately, Matt Canavan sits on that committee, and that inquiry is looking at disinformation and misinformation in climate change. Now, they're aiming at people like me, and they're obviously going to make it illegal for people to make contrary comments to the government mantra. And that, to me, is the epitome of totalitarianism, which I've seen in these countries I've worked in. I've spent also a couple of months in the Soviet Union. I can smell it coming. And so I think we have to be prepared for it. I think the minor parties are the only solution to this. The major parties have dropped their ball. They are only looking over their shoulder at city electorates, and they're not looking at rural electorates who are being destroyed. We're destroying the environment by putting in these wind factories and solar factories and farmland with these renewable energy zones. We are destroying this country, and I hope I can live long enough to say, well, you were wrong, I told you so, and you've changed your policy. Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure who's more scary, Greta Thunberg or Ian Plimer. You can choose after listening to that. Ian, we are very grateful that you made the trip up today. Ian makes no secret of the fact, obviously as a geologist, that he has an association with the mining industry. Well, in true form today is FIFO, fly in, fly out, and he very kindly has come up from Adelaide for us at his own expense, and we're very grateful for that. So thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate it. We've got a small token. I don't think it's South Australian, Ian, but hopefully it's from. It might be the cool climate variety, but hopefully it's a good libation. Please avail yourself of Ian's books at lunchtime. He's hanging around. Have a chat. Make sure he gets some lunch, and that'll be great. After lunch, we'll be back here at what time? It's 12:30, 1:15 sharp. We are a political party. This morning has been about policy and commentary, and that's important. This afternoon is going to be about the politics, kicking off right after lunch with our own Jack Snelling, talking about our federal election experience and learnings there. So please enjoy your lunch.